Hello, and welcome to Lessons Learned. My personal experience about spiritual, my spiritual path in inclusivity that I feel is especially important for anybody in the field of ministry. And so I wanted to share it with those of you who are considering ministry as your path. You know, in unity, and one of the reasons I love unity and chose unity for my ministerial path is we talk about oneness and inclusivity and religious diversity and say that we allow people to travel their own path. But in this course on inclusive ministry, I learned so much more than religious diversity. I learned not only about the religions, but about how we are to come together with them. And in reflecting on these different faith traditions that, for the most part, I knew very little about before, and my experiences with them over the years, and how they've affected me, and how, with my new understanding, I can use those lessons to help others. I'm recognizing that in religion, as in everything else, the other is me. I feel that I'm now prepared to enter into more meaningful relationships with people of all faith traditions. And it starts with education, conversations, and most of all, a willingness to get to know yourself and others. So I'll start with my earliest recollection of other religions. I grew up on the east side of Detroit in a predominantly Catholic neighborhood, and the people around me, if they weren't Catholic, were Christian of some type or atheist. It was in my late teens that I became aware of a controversy that was facing the suburban area just north of me. They were building a highway that had been started construction many years before and kept meeting with opposition. Well, this time it was the Orthodox Jews that were giving them a hard time about completing this road. And one thing that I didn't know about Orthodox Jews at that time, but I recognize now, is that they tend to live in concentrated geographical areas. One of the reasons for this is they strictly adhere to no travel on the Sabbath day. And for this reason, it was important to them that their synagogues be a part of their neighborhood. So this highway that they were trying to build through their city would interrupt this flow. The people would not be able to walk to their synagogue. And I remember hearing things, a prejudice that was saying, you know, if they finally got that road approved to go through, and now these black hats, these old Jews, are going to try to stand in the way. Get over yourself. And I remember thinking, yeah, just go to another church. What's the big deal? Because that's what I had heard. Well, now I realize how important it is to them that they be able to walk. I had formed a prejudice against Orthodox Jews and judged the strange way they dress and their religious customs. And now I realize that their kosher dietary styles and their daily worship and the intense study that they do of the Torah um, is so very important to who they are. How could that possibly be wrong? And so what ended up happening is they got a rabbi to sit on the planning committee for this highway. And finally, they were able to explain the importance of it. And so what they did is they built these, the overpasses that go over the highway. Well, they built them so wide that they were actually parks up there with trees and benches and everything. So they were part of the neighborhood. So even though the houses of some might be divided from the synagogue on the other side of the highway, this park, if you will, that crossed over the freeway kept them connected and allowed them to walk. So just an aha about a prejudice that I held about those darn black hatters, and they call them because they wear the tall black hats as part of their attire, um, that I had formed a judgment about that based on what I heard from others. So scrap that, moving forward, and grateful that I don't have to hold prejudice anymore. Um, so next, when I was in college, I was taking a social studies class, a social science class, perhaps it was sociology, and a group of us were invited to go witness a Cherokee ceremony, some sort of a powwow or ceremony. And what I didn't realize at the time is the Native Americans, um, their tribes were very religious. This was their religion. And so I was very excited about it and a little bit apprehensive, but I went with a small group of people. And it turns out that what they were celebrating was the new moon ceremony. And there was some sort of induction going on. And they were explaining to us what was going to happen during the ceremony and what we could experience. And then they came around and said, are any of the women in the group currently experiencing their menstrual cycle? And I thought, how dare they ask such a thing? Well, I was, and I almost didn't say so, but I did. And I was quickly escorted with a few other women from a different group out of the room and into a separate room and told that I was not going to be able to participate in the ceremony. Well, I was really upset about that because I didn't understand. I was there to learn. How could I learn? But what happened in that separate room was so powerful for me. And I connected with the Cherokee women that accompanied us into that room. And they explained to us that during the time of menses, the women were considered so powerful. And they thought that women had special intuition at that time and maybe a direct connection with creation. And so their power could not come into the circle, not because, as I thought, that menses was seen as dirty or unclean in some way, but because it was so very powerful. So, in this room where those of us who were experiencing that time were taken, we were told legends and explained their religious beliefs. And remember, we made some sort of a feather craft, and we were able to play a drum, and a lot of things were explained to us. And I walked out of there that day, and when I compared what I experienced with what the others who had participated in the ceremony experienced, my experience was much richer because I had actually made a personal connection with somebody with very different views in religion than I had currently had. And it was a beautiful connection, and we felt a oneness that was something that I hadn't known before. So fast forward several more years, working in unity with the YOUers. And we used to, the first Saturday of each month, do something for the community, for the good of the community. And so one of our regular activities is we participated in a food bank. It was real close to the church, in this food bank called Gleaners. They had lots of groups come in there, and I think they used like 20 people at a time, and they set them up in 2-hour increments, and everybody had a station to work at. It was very, very well organized. So we arrived very early one Saturday morning to find out that there was some kind of cross in communication, and there was another group scheduled at the time we thought we were scheduled. We both thought we were scheduled at the early time slot, and actually one of us was not scheduled until 2 hours later, but it wasn't clear who. So this other group was a group of youth from the Baptist church just a couple miles down the road from us. So while the adults were all trying to figure everything out, the kids began mingling and they said, well, I can stay for the second shift and I can stay for the second shift. So turns out like half of them from one group and half of them from the other group could stay for the second shift. So we decided to mix it up and to mingle together. So I was in the second group, and while the first group was working, we were in a cafeteria, and they brought us some nice snacks and some board games to play, and the kids from the two groups were intermingling. It was just such a beautiful thing to witness. The kids playing board games together, and they were talking about their youth groups, and they were talking about what they do in church on Sundays, and they were talking about their similarities and their differences and what they like to do. And they had such a rich communication about their faith that we as adults probably wouldn't have been able to take. So an action was taken, and we cooperated in that time and learned from one another. And by the time it was our turn to go in and actually pack the food, the kids all had like new buddies from the other group. And at one point, we all broke into song and they were challenging each other with different songs they like to sing. A couple of them I remember is This Little Light of Mine and Let There Be Peace on Earth. And it was just a beautiful experience of two similar but quite different faith traditions coming together to work for the good of the whole in cooperation with one another. A few years later, in my Unity experience, we had an interfaith celebration, and I had never attended one. And I remember being mesmerized by the many things that I heard and experienced that evening. But the one thing that really stood out for me that I still remember to this day is the inspiration that I received from the person from the Baha'i tradition. Their message sounded so very similar to what I was familiar with in Unity, that we're one, that humanity should celebrate our oneness. But the thing that stood out for me is that as we all do our individual parts, we are helping the collective whole move into the maturity of this oneness. And then they said we could begin doing this every day in our own relationships. And that the relationships that we wanted to focus on the most was our relationship with the God of our faith and with ourselves. And I think maybe that meant so much to me at that time because I was struggling in relationships. I was raising teenagers and had just split up with the guy who I was sure was Mr. Right. And to be told that in order to really make a difference in this world and to be a part of the collective oneness, the most important relationship for me to nurture was the relationship with myself and my higher power, is a message that I've carried with me, that I live by, and that I share with others. So that is a different faith tradition that greatly inspired me. And finally, the time when I reflected that I had recognized a difference with people of a different faith tradition and came to admire and appreciate them in spite of the differences. So I was living in a small community at the time, and middle class, mostly white. And a young girl started working at the coffee shop on the corner, and she wore a scarf on her head. And I didn't know at the time that was called a hijab. And I was really not sure what religion she was associated with. So I asked her one day, She was super friendly, and I went in there on a regular basis. So I said, "What is that? What is that that you wear, and why do you wear it?" And she said, "Thank you for asking." I was so impressed by that because she was just a young girl. "Thank you for asking." And she took the time to give me a basic explanation of why they wear the hijab. And I had a new appreciation, an understanding that I didn't have before. She said, most of the time, people just stare and they make assumptions about her being Muslim and what that means. So she was grateful that I asked. A few months later, there was a sign up on the door, and I had been aware that the owner of the small coffee shop had been quite ill and was not running the store on her own anymore. And so this young girl had kind of taken over. So there was a sign on the door one day that said, for these certain dates, and it was a long period of time, we will be closing at 5 p.m. And normally they were opened until 8 p.m. And it said for Ramadan. Well, I didn't know what that meant. And so again, on a day that I was there and there weren't many people around, I asked her, "What is Ramadan and why does it require that you close early?" And she explained to me that Muslims around the world celebrate Ramadan as the first introduction of the Quran to Muhammad. And they practice a month of fasting, and not just fasting from food, but fasting from other things, and they fast during the daylight hours, no eating or drinking, even water. um, and that's done for cleansing. And during that time, they increase their prayer and they work on self-discipline and they really go within. And I thought, we do something like that. It's so very different, but at the same time, there are likenesses. And then she talked to me about the when they do eat and drink and what they do eat and drink and the big celebration that comes at the end where they have a feast that sometimes lasts for days. And she said it makes everything so worth it, because everybody feels new, everybody feels refreshed. And I thought, what a wonderful thing to do with your family and with your community and with your faith group to strengthen your own personal path and faith. So that was a great recognition. I really had a wonderful admiration for their self-discipline and the things that they do during this entire month of fasting and self-discipline. So all in all, this class has taught me a lot, and reflecting on what I had learned over the years that I didn't really realize that I had learned, and recognizing now that there's so much more to learn as I open up to new faith traditions and other ideas, and wanting to experience along with. And again, recognizing that it begins with a willingness, and the willingness to be open and to educate myself, and to not just do a search or read a book about what this certain religion does or what their faith tradition means, and get a skewed view, but go directly to the source of the people, and attend their services and their ceremonies and their celebrations, and ask the questions and have the powerful dialogues. And what I've realized in the oneness, that we are all one, but we're not all meant to be the same. I view it like a jigsaw puzzle. And when the jigsaw puzzle is complete, it creates a beautiful picture. But each piece is as individual and as important as every other piece. They're not the same shape, and they're not the same color, and they don't make up the same part of the picture. But without any one of them, we'd never get the full, beautiful picture. And that's how I see inclusivity in religious diversity, and embrace the different faith traditions. I hope that you will consider doing the same. Namaste.